Hello, welcome to the critical move of Telesur. July arrived, and with the 7th month of the year, Germany also became the rotating president of the European Union through its Council. Under what circumstances does the European motor take over the reins of the bloc that, according to experts, is leaking? What does the COVID-19 pandemic and decisive events, such as the US elections, bring to this second semester? How will these factors affect the relationship between the subcontinent and the rest of the world? Let's deploy the board. It starts the first move. German Chancellor Angela Merkel presented Germany's plan for the period of its rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union to the European Parliament in Brussels. The head of government called for support for Europe's recovery plan in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, of which the subcontinent was the second epicenter after China. Let's hear his statements. Germany's top priority as President of the Council of the European Union is to bring Europe out of the crisis, united and strengthened. But we do not only want to stabilize Europe in the short term. It is not enough. We also want a hopeful Europe. The pandemic cannot be fought with lies and misinformation, nor with hatred and unrest. Our common goal is to reach an agreement as soon as possible. The escalation of the economic recession reminds us that we must hurry. There is no time to lose. The poorest will pay the price. I hope we can reach an agreement this summer. It is not without Europe, but with Europe that we can maintain our convictions and freedom. For this, we need more than ever orientation towards fundamental rights, and more than ever, mutual support and cohesion. Europe will only remain Europe if, on this basis, it offers innovative responses on the challenges of climate change and digitalization while facing up its responsibilities in the world. The challenge ahead of us, both the rotating presidency and all of us in the next 6 months, could not be greater. More than 100,000 lives have been lost in Europe in the last 6 months due to COVID-19. We have entered the worst recession in the last 100 years. We must learn the lessons, and we must do it together. If we do well, we can emerge stronger from this crisis with a common goal for Europe, and thanks to the economic response plan, free the pandemic, known as FRES, Next Generation EU. During this presidency, we will make effort to reach agreement with the United Kingdom in our new relationship, respecting our principles and preserving our European unity. Last week, I concluded my first round of bilateral discussions. Have been intense and somewhat difficult, sometimes very difficult, but always in a constructive spirit. We are not yet at the end of the negotiations. There's a lot of work to be done. I am convinced that we can make progress provided that, on the one hand, the member states are determined to cooperate more with each other. We can only do this if everyone agrees to take a step for the other. If we all, the member states of our institutions or the European Union, remain frozen, blocked, immobilized, in our view, there will be no solutions, and there will be no build-up to the challenge for the European project that unites us. I repeat, the only opinion is to take a step in favor of the other. What is the focus of Germany's responsibilities as the rotating president of the Council of the European Union? Let's review. The presidency, also known rotates between the 27 member states of the European Union every 6 months. During this period, Germany will have the important task of driving the Council's discussion on the legislation. It also ensures cooperation between all member states as an honest and neutral player. The tasks of the presidency of the Council of the European Union include organizing and chairing meetings of the Council and its preparatory bodies. It focuses on preparing the work of the Council in the most efficient way possible and finding promises capable of allying the different positions of the member states of the bloc. Representing the Council in relations with the other institutions of the European Union. but it must work to reach agreement on legislative proposals. To represent the European Union in relations with third countries, the Presidency is responsible for making statements on behalf of the community bloc to the United Nations or other conferences of international bodies. The order for the rotating presidency has been set by the European Council for the period from 2016 to 2030. Germany is next in line to hold the presidency of the Council, Portugal and Slovenia. These three presidencies form a trio whose joint program has been adopted by the member states of the Union. Let's take a look at what the European Union is, how this community bloc came into being, and how it comes into being today. European Union, united or disunited? The European Union is a political community governed by the rule of law, constituted as an international organization which seeks to promote and accommodate the integration and common governance of the states and peoples of the European subcontinent. It was composed of 28 countries, but after the departure of the United Kingdom in the process known as Brexit on January 31st, the number of members remained at 27. The bloc covers a territorial area of 4,233,255 square kilometers and a gross domestic product for 2018 of $22,030,854. The organization that would become the European Union was created in the period after the Second World War. Its first steps were to boost economic cooperation with the idea that, as economic interdependence between countries increased, the chances of conflict would diminish. However, the community bloc was not established as such until 1 November 1993 by the Treaty of European Union. Its main objectives are to promote peace, its values, and the welfare of its citizens, to provide freedom, security, and justice without internal borders, to promote sustainable development, combating social exclusion and discrimination, promote scientific and technological progresses, strengthen economic, social, and territorial cohesion and solidarity, as well as establishing an economic and monetary union with the euro as its currency. The European Union has developed a legal and political system which is governed by complex internal operating mechanisms and procedures which have evolved throughout its history to a form hybrid system of transnational government that combines elements close to multilateral cooperation, although strongly structured and institutionalized, with others of a supranational vocation, both governed by a regional integration dynamic. The bloc is governed by an internal system under a regime of representative democracy, has created a single currency, the euro, used by more than 340 billion citizens in 19 countries of the subcontinent. Nevertheless, the dream of a consolidated European Union has been overshadowed by austerity policies, together with the recent economic crisis of the member nations and the increase in migrants due to the warlike conflicts that have been fostered by the European powers themselves, to name but a few problems that have fractured the stability of the entity, which deserves to be questioned and which has led it into a kind of existential crisis, according to analysts. I invite you to check some digital information that will help us to understand the coming analysis. Let's see what Corriere della Sera says. Pedro Sánchez al corriente. A titanic response to the crisis in Italy and Spain are packed for the EU. It is an interview with the president of the Spanish government by Aldo Casulo. Journalist. The Italian and the Spanish governments are the promoters of the letter that the European Council of 25 March requesting the creation of shared debt. Now the result seems close. It is. The objectives are three. The agreement must be concluded within this month. We must not reduce the size of the recovery fund and the ratio between the non-refundable part and the portion of the debt. The resources must be provided quickly and over a long period of time so that the economic recovery is structural. Journalist. Didn't you expect more from France and Germany? Macron has signed his letter, then he gave the impression of realigning himself with the German position. position. Spain suggested an even larger size of the recovery fund, but if we combine the Employment Insurance Fund, the month, and the Investment Bank's resources with the 750 billion indicated by the European Commission, we are talking about an unprecedented proposal which exceeds 1 billion. The essential thing is that Europe should build its own model, transfer shared debt, revitalization of the welfare state, and strengthening public health. Journalist: will you go to Netherlands and Sweden before the Brussels summit on the 17th? Yeah, I have the utmost respect for Mark Rutte and Stefan Löfven, but they must recognize that there is no country that gives and receives. The fund is a common fund to which everyone contributes, and if we don't move, the single market is also at risk, from which the small countries of Central Europe gain greater advantages than we do. Journalist: will Spain use the resources of MES for health care? I know that in Italy it is an open political question. I believe that each country is free to choose and should not be stigmatized, whatever the choice. Spain has adequate access to credit, so for now we don't see the need to resort to MES. Journalist: you have signed a pact with companies and unions to spend 140 billion from the recovery fund that should arrive in Madrid. How will you invest it? Ecological transition, digital inclusion, training and defense of work, strengthening of welfare. Many ideas are common with Italy and the European Commission. The crisis will be brief, but it will be difficult. She said so. But how short and how long will it last? How long will it take for Spain and Europe to recover? The fall in GDP will be serious, also because from America to the Middle East, the pandemic is not over. But I am sure that the full recovery phase is beginning. That's why we need expansive fiscal policies for companies and for work. It is true. Before the question, it is true that at the end of the meeting you will take on to take a photo in front of the Picasso Guernica, the symbol of the Civil War? Yeah, for the Guernica means two things: memory and Europe, destruction and reconstruction. I see a pro-European impulse that we've never seen before. The COVID crisis can be remembered as the historical moment when Europe was reborn and built its destiny. You can read this whole interview and get a better idea of this subject, including the relationship between the Spanish head of government and the head of state, King Philip VI. You know that these days, these situations have been more controversial than usual because of scandals that have arisen around the King Emeritus. There is another portal, Sputnik, on July 3rd. Merkel prepares Europe to take relations with China. Listen to this, with China to a new level. I select some of its paragraphs. A new stage begins to Germany with the presidency of the EU in the second half of 2020. At the inaugural conference of 2nd July, Angela Merkel drew up a panorama of German leadership of an European level with China and autonomy when it comes to taking its own decisions with regard to the Asian giant. Merkel and her government are determined to press ahead with their project to hold the first EU-China summit in the 27+1 format for the first time in 45 years. Despite the postponements due to the coronavirus, and despite the tensions that have arisen between the West and China in the wake of the events in Hong Kong, let us not forget that China is Germany's biggest foreign investor. While the UK and Australia have announced their intention to give asylum to some Hong Kong citizens, and the US has announced new sanctions against China, Germany has preferred to remain more neutral. The German country stresses that it is always open to giving asylum without the need for special mention, and that it does not want to get involved in the dynamics of sanctions. The path of negotiations with China will not be easy due to the existing disagreements between Europe and China, but the European Union will not repeat every move made by the US on the issue of Hong Kong. wrong. This is what Yang Nian, professor of the Institute of Communication in China, tells to Sputnik. Angela Merkel is a sensible leader. We see that her stance on many issues is causing discontent in the United States lately. When it comes to relations between China and Europe, she also pursues a wise policy. Given the current situation of isolation by coronavirus, I feel that cultural exchanges with Europe will be somewhat reduced, says the professor. Deputy Director of the Institute of Europe and the Russian Academy of Science, Vladimir Bulov, stresses the dependence that Germany and the EU institutions are showing for the US and dealing with the complicated issue of relations with China, with special attention to their leaders. Despite the difficulty of this issue and the tension in relations between Brussels and Washington regarding Beijing, the EU is sticking to its guns. Berlin, represented by Angela Merkel, and Brussels, represented by Josep Borrell and Ursula von der Leyen, have a very balanced and pragmatic approach in their interactions with Beijing, the Russian specialist assures. One of the things that makes these relations difficult is the difference between Chinese and European values. China is a complicated partner for the EU, but Brussels builds good relations with it, something that Washington cannot say, and even less Trump. Let's take our first break. Remember, there is a strategic move in social media for you to participate. When the world debates between reopening borders and stopping outbreaks of COVID-19, Germany assumes the rotating presidency of the European Union. It is a semester also marked by events such as elections in the United States. How will Angela Merkel work? Leave your opinion. Let's take a short break. We'll be back soon. In what context does Germany assume the rotating presidency of the community bloc? What issues are presented to Berlin as short and medium-term challenges? Let's review. The crisis unleashed by the coronavirus pandemic is today one of the main challenges facing the European Union, both politically, economically, and of course, socially. In this context, Germany assumes the rotating presidency of the European Council. Europe has been one of the regions most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. To resolve the effects of this crisis, the European Commission presented last May an economic stimulus package worth 750 billion euros, which will be financed in part by debt issued jointly by the bloc. The anti-crisis plan would be distributed among the 27 member states of the Union through grants equivalent to €500,000 and through loans of 250 billion. In the political arena, the post-Brexit negotiations with the United Kingdom pose another challenge to future relations between the country and the community bloc. After the departure from London on January 31st, the parties are working to reach a free trade agreement. However, very little progress has been made. According to the Withdrawal Treaty, signed in October 2019, they will have until the end of this year to define the terms of the trade alliance. The differences between France and Turkey over the conflict in Libya would also condition Ankara's relations with the European Union. Following the incident in the Mediterranean between warships from both nations, the French foreign minister has asked his partners in the bloc for urgent talks on future links with the Ottoman country. In the midst of this panorama, the European Union announced the opening of the borders as of this month, for which it formed a list of the nations that will be able to resume their trips to this territory. Neither the United States nor Russia are on the unfortunate list, while China must first authorize the entry of Europeans into the Asian giant in order to be included on the list. Since the migration crisis of 2015, The issue has been one of the main political controversies for the community bloc. The situation has moved millions of votes and they benefit many parties. However, after 5 years of this humanitarian issue, the European Union has not managed to agree on a comprehensive migration and asylum reform of its member states. Let's take a short break. We'll be back soon. Today we do it in a different way. We start the analysis in our critical move. And we have Ernesto Juan Maestre, University professor. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Ray. It's an honor to be here sharing these ideas. And we're going to share it with Wadi, who is with us from Argentina. Hello, Ray. It's really nice to hear you. I'll start with you. We saw the circumstances under which Germany comes to assume the presidency of such geostrategic bloc, in spite of the difficulties it has been going through, as it is the European Union. What do you have to add to these circumstances? This is framed by the health crisis that has put the world on alert with the pandemic. Europe has not come out of this situation well, and I think there is something important in the middle of this, which is the elections in the United States. Everything they're doing to be able to win in November. I think it could make some move to Germany and the European Union, and I think this could have some repercussions within the European Union. So we're gonna have to be paying attention, and it's difficult to make an analysis without having these two issues in mind. Thank you. Stay with us. I also invite Geraldina Colotti from Italy to join us in this dialogue and stay with us for a few more minutes to reflect with us. We have Geraldina. Are you with us? Yes. Yes, I can hear you. Greetings. Here I have a friend of yours, Ernesto Wong, Professor Wong from Caracas. He sends you a big hug too. Hugs from him too. Well, we put the European Union on the geopolitical board today. That European Union to which your country belongs to. With the European look, how do you see the arrival of Angela Merkel to the presidency of this community bloc? Well, first of all, we must look at it from a global point of view. All that is happening with the pandemic is another example of the structural and systemic crisis in which capitalism is being debated at a global level. There are all the alliances, the blocs of these journalistic systems that are organizing, that are trying to do their business, which, according to all analysts, it is the worst crisis that we are facing and we are living since the one of 1929. The European Union is one of these blocs of alliances. one of the global capitalist system, and they are on the way in the totally subaltern framework, in spite of some commercial conflicts in the United States. And we are seeing it. For example, we can talk about Venezuela, which the European Union does, with some difference, because they are like sharks who have problems among themselves. As we have seen in the midst of this pandemic, they steal face masks, and the United States steals above all. And there is a redefinition that because of these power systems, they have to rearrange themselves. It will always be the case that they will seek to make more profit. And we know that profit and the relationship that exists between capital and labor will always go against the workers. This European Union, which is not an European Union, it is not an European Union of equals, but it is a completely asymmetrical European Union. Italy is the third economy. Italy is the third economy of the Eurozone, but what rules is Germany, and with a group of countries like Holland that are doing things on the tax havens that use that to avoid paying taxes in the other countries of Europe. And what are they doing? A power struggle to impose more favorable conditions, to continue with the same dynamic, to pay the crisis to the people. We can see how Spain is on the last step. But how are they trying to do it? As capitalism always does, with the military-industrial complex, which is the real engine that they want to put back on the table to rebuild their system, their alliance. And we must not forget this. In a crisis of hegemony, just as the North American hegemony is in crisis, so it is the hegemony of this alliance of sharks is in crisis. The economy of this shark alliance is in crisis, says Geraldina Colote. Do you share Geraldina's opinion, Professor? I think Geraldina mentioned the big trends, we could say, the big structural problems of capitalism. And it is perfectly like that. But in the middle of this situation, we have to visualize a little more the diagnosis of what is coming, because the dominant classes will continue to dominate as long as there is no workers' organization that can achieve victories in the countries and bring leftist governments to power. How is the left wing in Europe today? I think we have to take into account how there are political tendencies and ideological trends as well. In this case, there is an ideological trends in all of Europe towards the strengthening of social democratic ideas on one side, while there is a polarization of an ultra-right wing fascist tendency. That is why this government of Germany, of Merkel, have been willing to purge the armed forces. Some of these groups, this is also an aspect that has to be taken into account. But from the political point of view, the power, there is the fact that the United States has always had influence over Europe to the benefit of the United States itself. And now we are in the middle of a situation, given the pandemic crisis, that requires the participation of these capitalist states. But they must be more present whether through grants, loans for credit. You mean is actually to make themselves available to those who chose them. Exactly. And so among the challenges of these 6 months, Merkel's presidency, let's just say it's a sprint. Right, a race of speed and against the clock. And in that spirit, there's the issue of the US elections. Wadi mentioned it a few minutes ago. Wadi, to what extent will the elections influence the American nation's relationship with the European Union? Relations that have been shaken in recent times during Donald Trump's administration by the aggressive policy of the so-called sanctions. I think that will be seen as the polls go up or down. But I believe that just as the pandemic is a day-to-day issue, nothing will be resolved in the Europe-US relationship until one of the two candidates is firmly in the polls, or until November arrives and we know who the winner is. I think if Biden can continue to lead in the polls to Europe, it would be a relief on one hand, but also the pressure from Trump would be so much stronger. So they are between a rock and a hard place. The Europeans paying the price of having chosen this guy from the American empire. Thank you, Wadi. Geraldina, there is a phrase that caught my attention when Angela Merkel was assuming the presidency of the European Union before the Parliament in Brussels. She said, more or less these words: "An isolated entity cannot deal with this crisis. We have to unite so that together we can emerge." I repeat, there are more or less these words. This is what Angela Merkel said. In this purpose, to get out of the water in the second semester of the year, with which allies does Germany have? Only France, Italy, Spain? Let's not forget that if we make some sort of partition of what is today the European Union, we can see that there is a certain division between the Nordic countries and what the Mediterranean countries think, having Germany in the center. And on the other hand, we have the Brexit, which is still pending an agreement and negotiation solution. That's it. I share what Ernesto said before. We have to see, first of all, that the old Europe always has a double face, a double language, that for many years this international treaty has a side that is secret, a hidden side, a side so complicated, so complex, that always has a trap behind. It has to be seen always behind the rhetoric. In other relations, the correlation of forces of several alliance and field. For now, always the United States has an advantage. Why? Because, for example, NATO, as we have seen in the last virtual meetings, it has had with Europe, and NATO is the one that rules the economy, first of all. All the little fight that came out in the that are in Germany. This is only a symptom of what is, on the contrary, a rearrangement of this alliance within the framework of the military-industrial complex that is the engine that they want it to be for reconstruction and for the people's integration in this way. It cannot go beyond NATO. In Italy, we are the country that is under NATO's thumb for a long time, that has more than 100 military bases that have relations with straight direct relations with the United States. We have nuclear Gulf walls that start here, and in this new agreement, the bombs are going to be passed on to Poland in exchange for helping them in their relations. There's a political exchange, and economically, it is a war economy. These are interests that were agreed to make, especially with Italy, trade agreements to build aircraft carriers in North America. Here, in the middle of the pandemic, the workers without security measures and have continued to work in the war companies. It's not like in Venezuela, where our president, Nicolás Maduro, says between quarantine and production there is no contradiction, because there's a very low average of infected workers. And here it is the opposite. The poor, who are the ones who work, have to carry on their shoulders all the weight of the crisis that is in tension at these systems. Ernesto was talking before about the subject and these of the extreme right and the shock groups of Germany. This is a subject that he finds very well in war. That war that is going on as the engine of the capitalist rebuilding of the military-industrial complex. For example, these shock groups, which are Nazis, were groups that were training, that were advising Mr. Goudreau, with whom the same guide made his mercenary contract to attack Venezuela. There is a link between private security companies and after the fall of the Soviet Union, but before and after the Vietnam War, because the United States and the European Union also do not want to make land invasions. And the centers delegate to these shock groups, which naturally have this same supreme mercenary idea of the United States that are in Germany, to supposedly prevent the rebirth of fascism, but then not, because they developed as attack groups what they called as the Red Danger against communism. This is a general philosophy, the philosophy of the Southern Command, and the philosophy of Europe, and once again the example of Venezuela, which has been the target of these attacks, and which points the way to what all this repressive force is doing, that they are an engine of the imperialist economy. Thank you so much, Geraldina, and also Wadis. Thank you for your time for our critical move. Professor Ernesto is going to stay a few more minutes with us, but first, let's review the geopolitical role of the European Union in the rest of the world. Let's see. The European Union has maintained its support for the United States' incursions into its imperial logic. The big armament-producing firms, mainly English and French, added to the power of the oil companies, indicate similar interests in the Arab world. However, in commercial matters, there has been friction in the White House, especially since the arrival of Donald Trump as president. coupled with the imposition of traffic packages of the European bloc. The head of the Oval Office has said in more than one occasion that the balance of trade favors Europe with a surplus of $150 billion. However, the figure is denied by the community body, which points out that the difference between imports and exports favors the American country by $14 billion. The United States is Europe's largest export market. In 2017, it exported 13% of its production. Europe, on the other hand, sent 20% of its production to North America. Another dispute with the U.S. is its attempt to remove Russian influence in Europe, particularly in relation to the purchase of Russian gas through pipelines that come from Siberia and cross so much of the subcontinent. The United States is trying, through the imposition of sanctions on the participating European countries, to prevent the extension of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, a strategic project for Moscow due to its capacity to transport 55 billion cubic meters a year. The European Union is trying to consolidate and revive ties with Latin America. Such is the particular case of Cuba, a partner considered by the bloc as a bridge to the Caribbean. The European Union is one of the main investors in the island. In 2016, both parties signed a political dialogue and cooperation agreement, which is given due diplomatic follow-up, and where the priority is established bilateral relations based on mutual respect. With respect to Venezuela, the government of President Nicolás Maduro has urged Brussels to engage in respectful dialogue and to rectify its interfering position. This was recently ratified in a joint communique between the head of European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, and the foreign minister, Jorge Arreaza. With regard to its link with the Arab League, the European Union has shown a certain coldness, despite the fact that both blocs reaffirm the position on the allegedly under international law of Israel's settlements in illegally occupied Palestinian territories and reiterate the commitment to achieving the two-state solution. We saw then the European Union beyond its borders. And on this, I want to reflect with Professor Ernesto Wong. Our previous guests have also contributed with some ideas. Professor, before we start referring to certain particularities, I want you to remember, I know that you have taken some notes since we invited you to the program. What were the lines drawn by Angela Merkel as preordained tasks for her? We could call it a challenge. Yes, it's challenges and big problems. On the one hand, big problems, and on the other hand, problems that can be solved with some strength and agility in time. And it is about all that attempts against her time. One of the elements that she has to solve is the negotiation with China. As we have said before, China has its commitments in Eurasia, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has highlighted its three great things: the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are the countries that are in Eurasia, with part of the Middle East even, BRICS, and the relations with Russia. But the relations with Russia are in all the perspectives that Merkel has, that she has been inclined to improve the relations that she has with Russia. There is the issue of gas, which Europe cannot turn its back on, even though the United States is urging it to do so. That is why Merkel also poses the challenge of getting closer to the countries of the West and the Baltic Sea, which are the three countries where she will generate some questioning, like gas. But this is a contradiction in terms, or I would say that it increases the distance within the Atlantic Alliance with the United States, which is to reduce the influence of the United States in European countries, of the European Union. That's what she said, follow the Atlantic Alliance, but we have to count on ourselves. Was practically we have to count with ourselves. Yes, was practically the bond of contention. The United States of Trump on top of NATO. These two big problems that I've mentioned the links with the pandemic problem and the post-pandemic, which is dependent on getting a vaccine, to consider starting 2021 with a mass vaccination, and it's also a race against the clock. And it also requires a lot of resources. If that vaccine is achieved, then we have the problem that has generated the pandemic, the problem of Brexit, which is another problem that it has to be solved by Merkel. A few days ago, Angela Merkel herself said, "We have to be mentally prepared to make an exit without an agreement, and be prepared for that terrain where there is no agreement with the United Kingdom." There is the position of Germany that wants to have a hegemony in Europe. I said about 5 years ago that Europe was being discussed between the United States, Germany, and China. But in this race, China has a great influence in all European countries because of its policies directed towards mutual benefit, directed towards sharing things, and that makes Merkel's approach include China in all these analyses, because China is key to solving the whole economic problem, because it is the world's engine of production, and also the conditions under which it can do so even without Europe. This is an element that favors China. But China will reach certain agreements, which is another of the issues that remain pending. And there is also the issue of the fund, which has been planned, especially between France and Germany, to bring the bloc out of the water from the post-pandemic. There is a very strong discussion because it is planning that 750,000 million to distribute 500 billion to the problem of France to subsidy the most needed, which the Northern League does not agree with. There is a discussion, an argument, because this must also be synced with the other 250 billion that have been planned for credits. But if you look at the capital investments in the southern European countries, speaking of Greek-Latin civilization, which is present, the big investments in this area are from Germany, also from the United States. When the own companies of risk qualifiers some years ago made a social democratic governments go bankrupt to obtain facilities for investments in these companies, then there is a capital struggle. As the other guest said before, this is always present, but it must be taken into account in the geopolitical analysis, because Germany is the geopolitical center between the North and the Mediterranean. And no government of the latter can be in a position to precede it. Moreover, this approach is led by the group that maintains 80% of the GDP of the entire European Union, which is not a small thing, because they are the resources that interest the dominant classes in order to continue to dominate. But there is a gap between the ideological problem and the social democratic current that is being encouraged again. This Pedro Sanchez thing is not a coincidence, and that the candidate of Pedro Sanchez is the one who will take over the Europe group, and they finally decide in the second round that no one can be elected, which is a Russian name. Nadia. Exactly, very complicated, but in this matter, it's Germany in the middle. Germany is going to try to take control to exclude England. We could say that it's controlled twice, not only by Angela Merkel, but also by Ursula von der Leyen, who is going to be a great candidate to succeed Merkel, in my opinion. In 2021, Merkel has to retire, And I think she'll be her candidate. She could be. The problem with the UK is that the negotiations, or they're done with the European Union because they already consider it out. They consider the UK out, but the negotiation has to happen. And Merkel said that if you don't agree with us, you have to comply with the orders of the World Trade Organization, which are high tariffs, and that's a problem because Johnson has the prospect of the November elections in the United States, which is his great ally, while he's still trying to keep England inside the sphere, which is the strongest influence, which is proven to be. But if the Brexit problem in England is difficult because of the close vote, there's a lot of people who don't want the Brexit in the UK. That's where the problems between England and Northern Ireland come in. That's not to mention the precedent that marked the Brexit in the rest of Europe and that has several red dots there. And there comes another challenge from Merkel, who proposed to negotiate with Africa about the problem of migration. All of Europe was the colonizer of Africa, and that makes that big part of the capital they have in Africa. They have to take that into account to negotiate with Africa. They can't do it without migration. Some countries, but that's part the regularization, especially over that migration that goes across the Mediterranean. So, just one last important thing: the idea of digitalizing Europe, for that they cannot proceed from China. Well, Professor, I think we have reached some points that mark the geopolitical board of European Union. And let's see along these coming 6 months how this is going to be unraveling. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you. Let's go to conclusions. There are several challenges facing Germany in this second half of the year as it takes the reins of a disunited European Union, even in its tragedy to face the damage left by the pandemic in the subcontinent. No less important is what the Atlantic will decide, as it will decide the relations, also battered during the Trump administration, with the Eurozone. And meanwhile, the Chancellor urges the 27 to look at China, not with the eyes that Washington wants the geostrategic dragon to be seen, a post that will decide the success or failure of the Merkel's administration in a bloc whose agenda cannot be left out. The pending subject of migration, the tension with NATO, and a greater reapproachment with Latin America. Will Merkel succeed? Many people are pinning their hopes on her. For today, we close the geopolitical board.